Hello and welcome to the continuation of discussion for the Unit 6, which is the Advanced Data Modeling. So let's continue on with the discussion of the entity cluster. So when we are developing an ER diagram, so we can entail a discovery of possibly hundreds of entity types and their respective relationships. Generally, ang ginobra na siya ni data modeler, mobra na siya sa initial ERD that contains a few entities. So we can say that start small, and then as the designer, diba, database designer tries to improve, so gamatamit na siya dako. So as time goes by, so makalabot na siya 100 nga entities, and then the relationships that will crowd the diagram to the point of making it unreadable and efficient as a communication tool. So dapat purpose ng design is to become a efficient communication tool. So in those cases, you can use entity cluster to minimize the number of ERDs in number of entities shown in the ERD. So ginaano yan. Si entity cluster na yan is do ginapakya ang all of these groups of entities into a single cluster. So this entity cluster is called a virtual entity type. So virtual ni siya nga entity to use to represent multiple entities and relationships in the ERD. This contains so cluster contains two or more entities and relationships. In this case, so to ma-reduce ang number of class or entities nga present sa ato nga ERD or ERM. This can avoid the display of attributes to eliminate complications that results when the inheritance rules change. So magda-form ni siya si entity cluster by combining multiple interrelated na entities into a single abstract entity object. Siyempre, ginarelate naman siya class entities that are related to each other. So, hindi mo na pwede nga ibutang sa cluster si entity that is not related to the other entities present sa entity cluster. So, matawag na siya nga si entity cluster as virtual or abstract. So, di ba, hambata nga virtual entity. So, in the sense that it is not actually an entity in the final ERD. So, siya, temporary na siya nga unit or housing for all those entities and then the relationships. So, with the implementation so wala na si entity cluster is not present. Okay, so this is example ni siya sang tiny college nga ERD. So, we've encountered this on the previous na units, di ba? So, here we can, manotice nyo nga may blue nga entities. So, which is the location and then the offering. So, may arta 2 entity clusters. So, this represents nila ang entity clusters. So, may legend that says that this is an entity cluster. So, we have the offering, and then which the offering so this contains the semester, the course, and then the class entity. So, these entities right there are related na siya. As for the location, diba? So, may arat siya sang room and then building entities. So, okay. So, muna siya ang purpose ni entity clusters. So, para hindi na siya magamo as kung i-expand mo na siya, diba? So, nakita naman sa previous or you can check it on the previous slides. Kung expand na siya, so dako-dako na siya. So, kung maybe magutok na ang aton nga diagram. In this case, you can definitely use an entity cluster. Okay, so let's move on to the next topic. So, which is the selecting the primary keys. So, we've discussed the purpose of primary keys, diba? So, this is a single attribute or some combination of attributes. So, a combination of attributes ni siya that which uniquely identifies each entity instance. So, this is one of the important characteristics of the entity. Diba? Sa entity integrity, diba? Dapat ang aton primary key is not null, dapat unique siya. So, ang function niya sa primary key is to guarantee entity integrity. Yun niya. So, very important siya. So, furthermore, the primary keys and then foreign keys work together to implement the relationships in a relational model. So, ga-work na siya. Diba? How it works, diba, is these primary keys can be foreign keys of some tables that establishes the relationship. Therefore, the importance of properly selecting the primary key has a direct bearing the efficiency and effectiveness of the database implementation. So here, we can say that we can choose the primary key by selecting or the natural keys or natural identifier. So we can say that this natural identifier is a real world identifier siya, uniquely identified real world objects. You can say that these primary keys on these attributes will represent the real world. So kaya do familiar na ang some users, diba, familiar na si BC Sign. So we can definitely use it as a identifier or as the primary key. So this, yes, familiar na siya and users and forms part of their day-to-day business vocabulary. So kung si primary kita, so that is a related sa real world man din. So ginagamit sa real world, so we can say that this is a natural identifier. So this is used as a primary key of the entity being model. So for example, sa class, sa inyo students, sa classes, diba, sa ato nga sections. So we have our student IDs, student class section IDs, diba, class codes. So that is ginagamit mo na siya. So ginagamit mo na siya sa aton nga daily operations. So that is considered to be a natural key. Usually, if an entity has a natural identifier, a data modeler uses it as a primary key of that entity being modeled. So generally, most natural keys make acceptable primary key identifiers. So, like sa employee, di ba? Ginagamit mo na ang ID, maybe to function on your function sa company. So that is considered to be a natural key. So these are the desirable siya nga primary key characteristics. So here, dapat unique values. So that is given for primary keys. Then non-intelligent, meaning wala siya sa embedded semantic meaning or other than to uniquely identify each. So dapat for uniqueness lang na siya. And then no change over time, diba? So dapat ang values ng attribute or sa primary key will not change over time. So hindi na dapat i-update. And then preferably single attribute na siya. So in some cases ang aton nga primary keys are compound. Diba, compound meaning two or more attributes, but preferably single attributes. Like sa students, mga entities or sa student IDs. So single na siya nga. And then numeric na siya most of the time. So ga-increment na siya from 0 to 1, 0 to 2, and well, sometimes siya alphanumeric, so combinations of words and letters, maybe to be unique na siya. Kung siyang purpose siya is to be. But most of the time, kung naman mga other nga entities, so most likely numeric na ang pwede nyo i-create as a primary key. And then the last na characteristic is security compliant. So must not be composed of any attributes that might be considered as security risk or violation. So wala siya contains ang nga private information such as the passwords the social security number, o kung naman na mga private nga data. Okay. So sometimes ang composite primary keys, diba? Or multiple attributes to be a primary key is ano siya, ginagamit yun. So, in the previous section, so na-learn ta nga ang desirable, ang characteristics ng primary key is to dapat single attribute na siya. However, that does not mean that the composite primary keys are not permitted. So, pwede na siya. So, pwede na siya mag-exist. So, each primary key combination is allowed once in the many-to-many relationships. But for the composite, composite entities, so this is so since two or more siyang entity, so most likely, sa many-to-many, may ginatawag nga bridge entity, So this one right here, so these are two entities nga many-to-many, but for conceptual, but for implementation, so mayroon siya sang bridge entity in between. So in these bridge entities, so ang iya nga primary key is composed of the primary keys here from the table 1, then the primary keys of table 2. So ang foreign keys yan is considered to be a primary key. So in that case, so identified na siya as a weak entities. And then si weak entities has a strong identifying relationship with the parent entity. So when used as identifiers of weak entities, it represents a real-world object that is, so diba si weak entity, so siya, ga-depend siya sa other entities. So, existent dependent na siya, ga-depend na siya on another real-world object. And then also, it is represented in the data model as two separate entities in a strong identifying relationship. So muna siya ang most likely ang matabo kung magamit ta sang composite primary keys. So here, diba? So for in the previous slide, so this used to be a many-to-many relationship. So student has many classes, but in implementing it, going to the implementation, nag-add ta sang bridge entity. So the composite primary key, so this one right there, so this is the composite primary key. So this provides the benefits of ensuring that there cannot be duplicate values. So muna siya desirable na siya nga characteristic. Okay, so let's move on to surrogate keys. The surrogate keys, so this is the primary key used to simplify the identification of entity instances. So this kung ang simplify, ang purpose mo lang sa primary keys is to identify mo lang sa entity instances. So maybe due to the uniqueness, so there is no natural key. Then selected candidate key has an embedded semantic content or is too long. So in some instances, a primary key does not exist in the real world na siya. So wala ka maobra nga as a primary key for that. So in these cases, it is standard practice to create a surrogate key. So do replacement na siya sa artificial nga key. So ang purpose ni siya is to provide the entity instance a unique property. So ang pina-create ni sila by the database designer to simplify the identification of the entity instances. So gina-require siya ensuring that the candidate key of the entity in the question performs properly. So performs properly ni siya when searching it out. So kung mag-search ka na. So this uses a unique index and not na constraints. So a system assigned primary key dyan. So amo na siya kung sometimes kung wala ka gid ma-provide, so automatically ang system yan na ang gahatag sang primary key. So in this case, na siya. It's called a surrogate key na siya. And then ang properties na is they are generated numeric, diba? From 0 to 1 and auto-incremented. So meaning as we add more data, so go auto-increment na siya ang atong nga primary key. Then surrogate key has no meaning in the user's environment. So it exists only to distinguish one entity instance from another. So wala siya ginagamit sa daily operations, hindi. Mula siya, ang purpose na is to be unique. So one of the practical advantage of a surrogate key is that because it tas no intrinsic meaning. So, values na siya. Okay, so let's move on to the design phase 1. So, here we have implementing the one-to-one relationships. So, foreign keys works with primary keys to properly implement relationships in a relational model. So, muna siya. And then with the rule here for implementing one-to-one relationships is we put the primary key of the parent entity on the dependent entity as the foreign key. So here we have the table 1 and table 2, table A and table B. So we put the primary key from table A to the dependent. So B is dependent of A na siya. So mayroon siya isang primary key and then this becomes the foreign key. That is mostly or the common ways of designing implementing a one-to-one relationships. And options is for selecting and placing the foreign key of place the foreign key in both entities or place a foreign key in one of the entities. So in this one, like kung nag-place ka be sa sang foreign key be sa other side lang, so that so we place the primary key of the entity on the mandatory side and the entity on the optional side and make the foreign key mandatory. So in this case, siya ang constraint na is one side is mandatory and the other side is optional. Kung both optional, the action nila is select the foreign keys that cause the fewest nulls or place the foreign key in the entity in which the relationship or role is played. When both sides are mandatory naman, so katulad sa case 2, or consider revising your model to ensure that the two entities do not belong in a single entity. Okay, so here we have a figure that illustrates the employee managers department relationship. So note that in this case, the employee is a mandatory to department. So therefore, the employee number is placed na siya as a foreign key in the department. So alternatively, you might also argue that the manager role is played by the employee in a department. So here, the next case is we have time variant data. So time variant data is we have data whose value changes over time. So bigyan na update na ang values. So update na maybe so for example na siya is sa aton nga employees, diba? So samtang go ba na siya as employee, so over time so mayara siya sa salary upgrade, mataas na yung salary. So gin-update yan na ang value sa salary. So in this case, required na creating a new entity in one-to-many relationships with the original entity, and then the new entity contains the new value, the date of change, and then the other pertinent attribute. So this one like this, so makita na sa diba? So makita sa one-to-many relationships with the original entity. So original entity, the employee, and then the new entity is the salary history. Para sumatrakta kung saan naman na nagsaka ang salary ni employee. And then ang specific value. So the storage of time variant data requires changes in the data model. So when we say may history, so most likely ginatrack na siya. So may track ka na when the salary changes for that time. So may mag-change ba yung salary ko, picture, mag-change ba siya next month, kung may record na siya dapat sa next month, diba? Sa database that specifies kung nagsaka ako ng salary. So some time variant data is equivalent to having a multi-valued attribute in your entity. So to model this type of time variant data, you must create a new entity in a one-to-many relationships with the original entity. So muna na siya. This new entity will create the new value, the date of the change, and other attribute that is pertinent to the event being modeled. This employee's salary story will track all of the changes of the salary of a specific employee. So other time variant nga data can be turned into one-to-many relationships into a many-to-many relationships. Dari sa So assume that in addition to employee, so your data model must include data about different departments in the organization, and which employee manages each department. Assuming that each department is managed siya by only one employee, and each employee can manage one department at most, but then a one-to-one many, like this one, a one-to-one relationship would exist between the employee and the department. Pare since diba ga-change na siya ang managerial nga change pa na siya ang manager sa isa ka department so over time. So pwede mo na siya matrack ng changes. So at 2011, so yan naman to employee and nag-manage. 2012, 2013, so ma-record na siya. And then madala diri sa manager history nga entity. So the flexibility siya of the model proposed in this figure becomes more apparent when you add the one-to-many, one department employs many employees relation. So in that case, the primary key on the one side, the department ID, and on the many side, the employee as the foreign key. So now suppose you would like to keep track of the job history for each company. You probably want to store the department, the job code, the date assigned, and the job salary. So to accomplish that task, you could multiply in this figure right here, may asang job history. So that job history will record all of the changes of the employees in that specific department. And then here we have another case where we call it a fan traps or a design trap. So let's discuss what is a design trap. So but before that, creating a data model requires proper identification of the data relationships among entities. However, due to miscommunication or complete understanding of the business rules or processes, it is not uncommon to misidentify relationships among entities. Under those circumstances, the ARD may contain a design trap. So this design trap occurs when a relationship is improperly or incompletely identified. So sa imo da nga ERD or ERM, kung nasa man da ang imo nga relationship, so most likely may matabong nga design trap. So in the real world, so this is represented in a way not consistent. So sa day-to-day nga businesses, day operations. So ang common yun siya nga design trap is known as the fan trap. So si fan trap, so they occur when one entity is into one-to-many relationships to other entities. Makita tayo na examples. So here, so this right here, so sa division is ano siya. So na-misidentify ang relationship between the team and then the player. So here, we have the example. Assume that may isang basketball league, di ba, has many divisions. So, siya many divisions. So, each division has many players. So, each division has many players and then each division has many teams. So, given those incomplete business rules, you might create an ERD that looks like this. So, as you can see here, the figure, ang division siya is a one-to-many relationships with the team, di ba? And then, one-to-many relationships with the player. So although the representation is semantically correct, so the relationships are not properly identified. So for example, there is no way to identify which player belong to which team. Okay, diba? For example, si Jordan, si Bryant, si Everson, sige, hindi na mabalaan kung din sila nga team. Okay? Na-connect lang niya siya sa division. So division kay relationship niya sa player is one-to-many. So note that the relationship lines for the division instance fan out on the team and the player. So entity does the fan trap label. So dopa may na siya. This one right there and then this one right there. So ang sakto niya to eliminate the fan trap, so we need to properly identify or improve the relationship. So i-revise na relationships between the existing entities. So here in this figure, so this shows the correct ARD after the fan trap has been eliminated. So note that in this case, the division is in a one-to-many relationships with the team. Diba? In turn, the team is a one-to-many relationships with the player. So, ang pagkaiba lang is naging rearrange. So, ang ni-change ang relationship nga connection. So imbes nga si division has one-to-many relationships with the player and the team, the division has one-to-many teams, has one or many teams, and then sa teams has one or many. So, naging disconnect si player from the division, naging connect siya from the team. And then next we have another design case, and in which we have the redundant relationships. So with redundant relationships, so this occur when there are multiple relationship paths between related entities. So with redundant relationships, so they need to remain consistent across the model. And then also with redundant relationships, so they also have simplified the design. Ay reduce ka na sa number of entities na exist. So although redundancy is often good to have in a computer environment, kung ga-backup ka, dapat may redundant data ka na. So redundancy is seldom good in a database environment. So, ang main concern diri is that redundant relationships, they remain consistent across the model. So, however, it is important to note that some designs use redundant relationships as a way to simplify the design. So, this one right there, ang redundant na siyang relationship, diba, between the player and the division. So here, so we have a transitive one-to-many relationships between the division and the player. So through the team and the set. Therefore, the relationship that connects the division and the player for all practical purposes is redundant siya. So in that case, the relationship could be safely deleted, diba? Delete na siya without losing any information generation capabilities in the model. Okay, so that's it for the unit 6. So I hope you've learned something. So thank you for watching and see you on the next one.